In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may begin from thee and by thee. Be happily and through Christ our Lord. Amen. Mary, help of Christians, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Yesterday we talked a little bit about the structure and nature of diabolic influence in general, and today we want to actually talk about how it actually applies to marriage. Because there's very specific things that the demons actually do. There's a very specific kinds of attacks that they actually do in order to bring the marriage down. Every marriage is usually subject to some kinds of attacks, and it usually depends. I'm always nervous when you get these couples who, I just love him to death. There's just no problems in our marriage. And then he is like, I just love her to death. There's just no problems in our marriage. I'm like, somebody's not seeing something, usually is what's going on there. Part of the difficulty, of course, too, is that after original sin, a marriage was affected because the relationship of men and women was fundamentally affected because of the sin of Adam and Eve. When Adam and Eve committed their sins, it actually affected them in different ways, which we'll see, because one is called the curse of Eve. Women got stuck with very specific problems because of Eve's sin. Men got stuck with another set of different set of problems, as well as the general problems of original sin. But one of those is the temporal punishment due to sin of demons affecting us. And that also means that the demons will use those defects of original sin against the married couple. And this is something that they have to be aware of. This is one of the reasons why knowledge of the Catholic faith is very important. It's not helpful for people just to be ignorant in general. Okay. So we want to start out first with what the general kind of principles that you need to observe when you're looking at how demons affect marriage. And the first and foremost thing to keep in mind is that the foundation of all division and strife within the marriage is always based on this one principle. And that is the first thing that the demons always do is divide the couple internally, that is in their own minds, by affecting their perceptions of each other. That's always the first thing they do. You can't separate people physically or externally, normally speaking, until you first divide them psychologically from each other. And so the first thing they do is they try and foster a negative attitude towards the spouse, and they're constantly affecting the perceptions. So let me give you an example. Very often, you'll see something similar along these lines. The wife decides she's going to do something for the husband because it's his birthday. Now, he's in bed, and it's till 7 o'clock in the morning, and she goes in because she wants to make him breakfast in bed, and she says to him, when are you getting up? And the reason she's asking this is in order to plan it so that when he's ready to get up, the breakfast is ready. But when he hears her say, when are you getting up, the demon steps in, puts in his mind, which, by the way, has been fostered for years usually. When people first get married, you know, they just, isn't she so wonderful? And then after 5 years, that old battle axe, right? And that's because over the course of time, they've had a narrative experience, but also, so there's legitimate psychological reasons why people can kind of divide, but there's also the demons themselves step in and say, see, she thinks you're lazy. She's wanting to know what time you're getting out of bed because you should be out of bed already. She thinks you should be out of bed and you're lazy. When all she was trying to do is an act of charity. In our community that we're trying to start, we have a general principle, which is any negative thought against any other community members is to be ignored. And if it's something that you think needs to be addressed, you go and you air it out immediately to the other individual in the community. We have found that 95% of the time, the negative judgment was baseless. When that happens, it doesn't happen too often because we kind of know how the structure of this stuff works. We know that the demons will literally put on your minds. Like, one of the things as a superior is that's always floating through my mind, and when I return is, oh, but they didn't get this done or this done or this done, and I show up and it's all done. Right? And what that's a sign of is the fact that they're actually trying to affect your perceptions about it, because that's the first place they have to divide you. So within the marriage, the first way you're going to protect your marriage from demons is not allowing them to affect your perceptions. I'm not saying you be an ostrich and stick your head in the sand about your partner's defects. In fact, one of the things that God does is he makes sure you get hooked up with the person who maximizes the sensitivity to your own defects. right? And the way we see this is I've always had a problem with X, and then I married a husband, and that is his problem. Of course it is. That's exactly why God has them there. In fact, most people don't realize that your spouse there is primarily there to chisel away at your defects. And it's interesting how God will give people a grace to see the defect of the spouse. And here I'm not even talking about necessarily that it's a jaded perception, because most of the time I think it is. People have a very jaded perception of their spouses very often after a little bit of time, and there's no recognition that in most cases of marriage, at least to people who are Catholic, there is goodwill. But the demons use a very specific mechanism, and that is the closer we are to somebody, the less protected we are internally, emotionally, in relationship to them. Because we're putting ourselves out there, right? Even the very process of dating, the guy has to go and ask the woman into court, and if that's going to happen, he's kind of sticking his heart out there, he's holding it to her, and he's just waiting to see whether she's going to accept his heart or she's just going to go crunch, right? It's the same thing within marriage. Because to have a normal intimacy within marriage or even within family, you don't put up the wall between the two of you, because the very nature of marriage is to have union, and so that wall has to come down. But that also means you're vulnerable in relationship to the other individual. And so the fact that spouses do things means that it's very easy to get hurt in that process. It's just the structure of it. But that means that most spouses don't have a willingness to suffer. But it also means that they're not looking at it necessarily, they're looking at it from their own emotional hurt point of view, or their own woundedness, rather than what was the spouse really intending. In other words, even in marriage, the relationship you have with the other individual has to be rooted in what is objectively the reality. What did your spouse really want? What you feel, I hate to say this, but what you feel is absolutely and utterly irrelevant. Say that again. The biggest mistake people make today is they take their emotions and they look through their marriage through the prism of their emotions, and all that does is provide the demons with the fodder, because the demons have access to the emotions, and so they can constantly foster that. That means the first thing you have to do in marriage, if you're going to get to any semblance of solid foundation, is you have to put aside how you feel in relationship to the individual to see what is the objective reality. And most of the time, most spouses will admit he didn't mean to hurt me, or she didn't mean to really hurt me in that particular case. And so really, I just have to put that aside regardless of how I feel. But the demons are going to be picking at that. And once the woundedness happens in relationship to the marriage, that pain in relationship to the wounds, the demons will pick and pick and pick and pick at it. That's why you absolutely, positively, in fact, usually when I'm doing marriage prep, one of the first things I'll do, or when I'm doing marriage counseling, is the first thing you have to do is you have to divide the combatants. Okay, you go to your corner and you go to your corner, right? Quit doing, which is one of the things that the demons will do, is they quit focusing on what you perceive is the problem of your spouse. You have to stop that. Because that's exactly what the demons are doing. See, he doesn't love you. See, if he did this, if he really loved you, he wouldn't do this. Look at how obnoxious he is that he leaves his socks on the floor, or whatever, right? Rather than looking at it as, hey, it's my opportunity to grow in detachment and lack of self-will and working on my duty and state in life, etc. There's a constant shift in the focus towards focusing on the negative of the spouse, and that's a sign that the demons have got involved. So the first thing you have to do is, okay, you go to the corner, you go to your corner. Second, you have to heal individually before you're going to be able to come together and have a normal marriage, because the demons, again, are going to be using the woundedness. This is one of the reasons why I tell people before, part of the reason for courtship is to determine, A, if the person has sufficient virtue, but that also means that they're not wounded, because a lot of people are very wounded individuals, or they have a very tender heart towards each other. But having a tender heart is a good thing. Our Lord and Our Lady had the most tender of all hearts. But if you don't have that perfection that they had, which is that ability to suffer well, then you're not going to be willing to be vulnerable in relationship to your spouse. And as a result of that, the wall is going to come up and the division is going to be there, and the demons are going to start building the wall block by block by constantly putting stuff in your head about your spouse. They're going to constantly be working on that. That particular aspect, and we're going to talk about what those individual blocks and bricks are, because there's specific things they're going to use against them, and a lot of it is based on just gross ignorance of the Catholic faith in relationship to the obligations of the spouse, etc. There's also a very common, so that's one of the things that demons are going to do, is constantly, by affecting your perception of them, they're going to try and get you hyper-focused on the injustice that occurs in relationship to the other spouse, when half the time it's in your head. I hate to say that, but most of the time the spouse is, he said X. Well, X is true. Yeah, but it hurt my feelings. And your point is? The point is that you have to be willing to put your emotions aside and focus on that, because if you don't, the demons are going to use that against you. One of the other things is that demons will do, and these are just kind of general things first before we get to the specifics, demons will very often make sure that one of the spouse is a slacker, usually in the area of the spiritual life. They'll always try and make one of them tepid, while the other one is really trying to advance in spiritual life. They'll really drive one of the spouses in order to be tepid spiritually and not have an interest in the spiritual life, in order to bring the other spouse, who is actually interested in the spiritual life, down. The number of spouses that actually both are actively on the same level, striving for, and the same level of desire to strive for sanctified perfection, is extraordinarily rare. And I'll admit, it's usually the guys that are the slackers in the spiritual life. That's usually where you tend to see it. And that's because of the fact that they get them focused on other things, their duties of their state in life or what have you. And that's why they get their focus. As I mentioned yesterday, there's a general principle among the demons: anything but God. Anything but God. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as it's not God. And even if it's your duties of state in life, even if it's doing the right thing by your spouse, as long as they get you hyper-focused on that and you're not doing it for God's sake or keeping God at the forefront, they've won. And so this is one of the reasons why you have to constantly be practicing recollection, even within the home. One of the things that demons will do within the home is just fill it with noise and bustling, unnecessary activity. If it's necessary, it's another matter, especially when you've got a big family. People will very often go over to people's family and say, "Father, sorry this is such a mess, and sorry it's so much chaotic." And I said, I grew up in a big family. I know what chaos is. So, in fact, I recently heard recordings that were made of me when I was 7 or 8 years old. And when I read that, listened to it, I'm like, man, I can't believe how obnoxious I was. All right. But the point being is that they're going to try and proliferate everything that distracts the family from God and from the spouses from focusing on God. Okay. But this means that if your spouse is a slacker, that just means that you have to be willing to do your part in order to help the person come up to speed, not beat them over the head. The first thing, again, part of what the demons are trying to do is replicate hell in this world. That's their goal. That's what they're trying to do. And part of that comes by having the kinds of relationships that they have with each other, which is what? They just beat on each other all the time. There's no capacity to love, or even when they help each other out, it's only for their own self-interest. And so even when they're done, they're like there's a certain demographic in our culture. It doesn't matter what good things you do to you, they never thank you, right? Well, it's the same thing that you'll see here, and that's one of the things we're trying to do within marriage. Our Lady said at Quito that the Freemasons, which by the way is a thoroughly diabolic institution, thoroughly from the bottom to the top. Now, I'm not suggesting that the people at the bottom actually are Satanists, but when you get to the top, there's a shift that's actually happening culturally. Historically, it was Luciferian, which is different from Satanic. Luciferian is you become your own god, or that's generally what the Freemasons were at the top levels. But now what's happening is there's a slow shift that's actually occurring among the Freemasons, where it's actually becoming satanic, openly satanic at the top. Okay. But they said Our Lady said at Quito, they were going to attack marriage during the time we're living in. And they've done a phenomenal job with divorce, etc., and everything that they're doing. Most people don't know this, but the ones who started the swing culture in this country were actually the Freemasons. The ones that are backing all of the gay marriage and stuff like that are the Freemasons, in addition to other people. But they're the ones pushing for this because they're trying to destroy marriage. It just means that they're the instrument. It's the demons who are really after the destruction of marriage. Why? Because marriage is the foundation of culture. If you can destroy marriage, you can destroy the culture. If you can destroy the relationship that the husband and the wife have together, you'll destroy the moral and spiritual formation of the children. So they understand the structure better than we do, and they know exactly where to attack it. So we want to go into the various areas that they actually attack marriage. So that's what we're going to do. You can keep track of your questions. At the end of the third conference, we'll have about 40 minutes for people to ask questions. Okay. The first is that the demons are actually attacking the very definition of marriage. The very definition of marriage. Marriage is defined as a solemn contract, not a covenant. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. It's a solemn contract in which a man and a woman, not Adam and Steve, it was Adam and Eve, confer bodily rights for the sake of having children. That's the formal ecclesiastical definition of marriage. A solemn contract in which a man and a woman confer bodily rights. What's happened in relationship to the discussion of a contract, it's a solemn contract because it's solemnized in front of, it's public, at a church, in front of a public minister of the church. So that's what makes it solemn. It's a contract because there's a conferral of bodily rights. Can it be called a covenant? Yes and no. It depends on what you mean by that. A covenant, if you look up a covenant in the traditional dictionaries, not the stuff that's happened after Vatican II, but the traditional dictionaries, they simply define covenant as a solemn contract. It's an actual contract. Why is it important? Because after Vatican II, there was a shift in looking at marriage from the point of view of everything other than the obligations of justice within the marriage. And so now you have this problem, it was a very subtle things that the demons did to get people focused on all the ancillary things other than what justice actually requires. It's a contract. It's no different from if I'm contracting somebody to mow my lawn, although there's a little bit of difference, obviously. But there is an actual agreement. You do X, I do Y. And it's a solemn contract. So can you call it a covenant? Yes, if by covenant you understand a solemn contract, and a covenant can actually add certain dimension to it, which is a perfectly legitimate theological discussion, as long as it's understood that the foundational aspect of it is an actual contract. There's a slow beginning discussions among some of the theologians of, we need to really discuss this contractual issue again because there's other issues that are rising. Okay. So this contract means that they have bodily rights over each other. It is a legal, that is a natural law contract, which binds the two parties gravely, which means if you fail to fulfill certain parts of the contract, you commit mortal sin. It's that simple. And this is why the demons are working on it. The demons have this general principle. If they can't get you to fall subjectively, they'll get you to objectively offend God because really their beef is with God. Although once in a while their beef is with us too. One time I was dealing with Beelzebub and he just says, I hate your guts. And I said, no, you don't hate me, you hate him. He says, oh, I hate him, but I hate you too. Okay, fair enough. All right. So, but the point is that they'll try and get people to objectively offend God by doing these things when they don't know. Okay. So it's a legal contract. The foundation is a natural law structure, institution that God established through the natural law with a sacrament layered on top of it. That's the nature of marriage. The tradition is absolutely clear that one must render the marital debt, that is, if one of the spouses reasonably asks for the conjugal act, it must be rendered, if it's reasonable, it must be rendered, otherwise it's mortally sinful to deny that request. So if you look at Prumer, who was kind of a moralist before, he was one of the best moralists before Vatican II, but you can find it in pretty much any moralist, he says, as often as the other spouse reasonably and seriously seeks the conjugal debt, sometimes called the marital debt, the other spouse is held out of justice to render it, and indeed under the pain of mortal sin. This has been the teaching of the church from the beginning until now. This is one of the reasons why St. Paul says, be subject to one another. Now, in another place he says, wives, be subject to your husbands, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But they have to be subject to each other. The demons suggest to people various things which make them think they have sufficient reason to deny the marital debt. You know, he's not being romantic, therefore you can deny the marital debt. Or they tend to think that rendering the marital debt after marriage is something that's voluntary. Well, in a certain sense it is, because you have to choose to actually fulfill your obligations. But it's not voluntary in the sense that after you're married, that somehow or another it's at your discretion when you pass out this goodie, so to speak. So that in point and fact, you'll hear the phrase gift of self. Now, that phrase can actually have a legitimate meaning. Gift means it's gratuitous, that you don't have to give it, which means it's only true on the day of your marriage. That's the day when the gift of self occurs. After that, it's no longer a gift, it's an obligation. And the demons have subtly pushed this idea that, well, since it's a gift, I can just say whenever I want to and when I don't. And it has to be surrounded with all this romance and food and, you know, a nice dinner and all these things, etc. Rather than, look, if the legitimate request is that you have to render it, or she. Because it's, by the way, it's going both ways. As the younger generation comes up, I'm a bit shocked at the fact that the guys are the ones denying the marital debt. It's kind of odd, frankly. In fact, you got to wonder, what kind of man is that? All right. Because most men, it's the opposite, right? The wife has to say, knock it off, right? Okay. After that, so after the marriage, it's no longer gratuitous. It's an obligation. Rather, now it's a matter of justice. So the demons will do several things in relationship to the marital debt. One, they'll get one of the spouses to ask for it too frequently, so that it overburdens and taxes the other spouse, or becomes difficult. Or they'll suggest to you that you don't have to enter the conjugal act unless romance is present, as I mentioned. Or, as St. Augustine says, it was actually a remedy for lust. So that they say, well, you shouldn't do it for that purpose. Part of it has to do with romance. Now, romance, human beings are the only beings that exist that have romance. You don't see rabbits walking up to a woman, you have such beautiful eyes, would you please come up, you know, your fur is so soft, I love your fur. They don't do that. And angels don't have it either because they don't propagate. Human beings are the only ones. But romance, by its nature, is ordered towards the conjugal union. It doesn't mean that every time you engage in romance you have to do that. But that's what it's ordered towards, and this is one of the reasons why in the beginning stages of courtship there's certain things about romance that have to be denied the couple, at least initially, until they get closer, until they're married. But the romance is an important thing, but it's secondary. I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't have romance in your marriage. You should. In fact, the demons will try and kill it. Why? The first commandment that God gave to Adam and Eve after the fall was go and be fruitful and multiply. That is the first thing the demons attack, is the fruitfulness within the marriage. This is what's happened. This is one of the reasons why they're working so hard to make sure that people are on contraception before, during, and after marriage. This is also one of the reasons why they're having people use NFP without a sufficient cause. Today we've got this silly thing floating around. People will say, because the Vatican, the popes, 3 times have said you have to have a serious cause to use NFP to avoid having children. Serious. So now you've got these people saying, well, serious just means that it's not light, and therefore it's not grave, though. It's not like mortal sin. Yeah, it actually is. In fact, if you look up the word serious in a Latin dictionary, it actually says grave. And that's how the church has always understood it, but now they're trying to shift it because NFP has become the 8th sacrament. But don't get me wrong, I'm not against NFP, especially when people are trying to use it to get, when they're trying to conceive, but when they're trying to avoid it when there's sufficiently grave cause. And the popes have laid out what the grave causes are. Right? So this isn't rocket science, but the demons have been playing with this because why? They're trying to get people to deny the marital debt in relationship to other, even though the people don't know, it still gravely offends God. So, then this means that they have bodily rights over each other. The marital debt, so there's two kinds of bodily rights. They used to call them bed and board. The bed we just got done talking about. Those are rights. You have a right to it. So if you ask your spouse, unless there's a sufficient reason, grave cause, which can be, if the husband says you're standing on a bus and the husband says, let's do it right here, right now. Yeah, sorry. Right. Okay. On the other hand, a headache doesn't suffice. Sorry, I got a headache. Can't do it. Now, it's one thing if it's a migraine and you're incapacitated. It's another thing if you're just using that as an excuse or what have you, or you have it and you're just like, I don't feel like it. Well, that's not the issue. When you got married, you didn't. Your contract didn't say, "I'll render the marital debt when I feel like it." It didn't say that. Okay, but the demons are going to work on that because why? They want to weaponize sex. They want to weaponize it. They want one of the spouses to get to the point where they're using it to control, manipulate, or hurt the other spouse. And they want to do that because, again, why? They want to divide them. The conjugal act is when people are the most vulnerable. Even asking for it puts you in a position of vulnerability, and so they want to make sure that people get hurt in relationship in that area to get it to the point where they're not rendering it at all. So the spouse has rights. People tend to refuse to accept this. People see marriage as license to engage in the conjugal act. They don't see it as the obligation to enter into it when the reasonable request is made. They don't see that side of it. And they don't want to accept it. You say this publicly. I've had people just outright reject it. Demons will cause each other to wound each other and then use the wounds to give excuse not to render the marital debt. That's usually what ends up happening. Or to other things, or to do other things that they're obligated to do. I'm not going to pick up that guy's socks. Who does he think I am? All right. Which, by the way, men, don't leave your socks on the floor. Okay. Demons use anger in order to precipitate our judgment, which we talked about, so that we think something is a matter of justice when it's not. I can't tell you how many times I've listened to spouses talk with each other, and they basically, because their feelings were hurt and they got angry, because St. Thomas says that, as I mentioned, anger makes us go to extremes in our judgment about whether something is right or wrong. And so when we get angry, we think something is actually just. The amount of punishment I'm putting on this person is proportionate, when in point in fact it's disproportionate. And so they'll try and get anger worked into the marriage and relationship to each other. And so what the demons are ultimately trying to do is make sure that the spouses never, ever get into the position of being willing to suffer at the hands of each other. That's what Christ did. Christ suffered for his spouse, us, the church, and he was willing to suffer at our hands for our sake. There has to be, what the demons are trying to do is change your focus from looking at yourself, because this is the things that you see this even with people who are possessed. The first thing the demons are always trying to do is get the person's attention to turn in upon themselves. I can't believe he said that to me. I can't believe he did this, or I can't believe she did that. Right? And so they're trying to get the person to look at their side of the equation. I suffered this. I went through this. I'm not going to do this because you did this to me, rather than being able to let loose of all of that and actually have benignity and benevolence. Benignity is the willingness to do good for people, and benevolence is goodwill. They're trying to chisel away at your goodwill within the confines of the marriage. And so that means that you have to make active choices over and over and over again in the marriage to combat that, which basically means what? You have to make the choices. And by the way, this doesn't apply to marriage. It applies across the board in relationship to relationships in general, or how you live in community life, or what have you. You have to make the choice to be benign and benevolent towards people on a regular basis. You see, your spouse's defect has little to do with your correcting it, except indirectly. In other words, you get these people, and this is another thing that demons drive. Wait till you get married, and then you can just beat her into submission. Or, she will change. Yeah, that's a delusion. People usually get more entrenched in their vices when they get married. So I tell people, look, you got to be able to live with his or her defects before you're even married. You know, you got to know what those are and being able to live with it. If you expect things to change because of the marriage, I'm the bearer of bad news. Sometimes I hate to be, sometimes it doesn't bother me in the slightest. The fact is that it's going to get worse because the demons are going to be under even more attack. Before the marriage, one of the things that they're going to try and do is they're going to try and get the couple to violate, to commit sins against each other so that when they walk into the marriage, those disordered soul ties. What's a soul tie? A soul tie is a connection that we have psychologically, emotionally, or spiritually to somebody as a result of justice or as a result of something we've committed together. What does that mean? When the spouses violate chastity before marriage, the demons are looking for that because that changes the psychological dynamic of the couple walking into the marriage, and then they can use that afterwards to chisel away at it by saying, see, you guys didn't even walk into this marriage right. You never should have gotten married. Now, obviously that's false. You should have gotten married. You shouldn't have done those things beforehand. But we can also, through those acts, end up with attachments. So you'll see couples who end up violating the sixth commandment together have these psychological attachments. God actually designed our brain that way so that when people go through that act, there's an actual physiological mechanism that actually causes a burning of that memory into your imagination very deeply. There's an actual physiological structure to it. And from that, then, even after you leave that and go to someone else, very often the soul ties are this attachment, this memory, these things that you have to these people. And those have to be broken by choice and working against them. But if they're trying to get that before you go into marriage, because they're trying to debilitate the marriage before you even walk down the aisle. So, these bodily rights, they'll use anger. It's one of the things you see in marriage. They're always trying to get the spouses to hurt each other, to say things. So they'll get a spouse who's kind of clueless to say something, and then the other spouse, they'll say, see, look, he doesn't care about you, or she doesn't care about you, and they're constantly doing that. Then, there's the effects of the sins of Adam and Eve. One of the effects was when Eve ate the fruit, the first thing she did afterwards is hand it to Adam, which means what? A, she's taken headship of the family, which we'll talk about in a minute. Second, she's trying to control him, which is why afterwards, at the end, God says to Eve, because you've done this, your desire shall be for your husband. And I've been told that in Hebrew, the desire for in that context means not just that you want to have a stronger inclination to have your husband around and you don't like him going off to work, etc., but it means the desire to control. This is the curse of Eve. It's something that women have to fight. They have to conquer that. And coupled with that is the demons are going to say, your husband is an absolute, colossal, unmitigated, possibly the worst idiot in the history of existence. And anytime he does anything against you, they're just going to reinforce that. See how stupid he is? He's just stupid. Now, he probably is, but that's beside the point. All right. And so they're going to constantly chiseling away at that perspective of how stupid he is, which does what? They're doing that to reinforce, I got to control this guy because he's so stupid. If I don't, he's going to do bad things against me again. Right? Then what does he do to Adam? So Adam does what? Because, it actually says it in Scripture, because you listened to your wife. Which means what? You listen to her, now you're going to listen to her. All right? She's going to try and control you, rant and rave, etc. And so, what is Adam's curse? One of the parts of Adam's curse, because there's several parts to it, same with Eve's, is the more she tries to control him, the less he wants to be around her. So he grows cold. And that basically means what? That the colder he grows, the more she's going to try and control him because she's got this inclination to desire her husband. And so as it goes on, it just gets more and more and more entrenched, and before it's over with, that it's an absolute matriarchy with the guy being effeminate and just trying to hide most of the time, going to his man cave. That's usually the structure of marriage if people aren't careful. And the demons will use that curse of Adam and Eve against them to constantly chisel away at them, to divide them. And so what you have to do is you have to realize this is the structure of it. This is what we're fighting against. And this is, again, goes back to you have to clear your mind and not, if you know your spouse is of goodwill, then you just have to realize either they don't see what they're doing or they're not perfect. This is one of the things that people think that, they walk into, this is going to be so wonderful. We're going to talk about that later. Marriage is actually a call to sacrifice. And there's actually a structure to that sacrifice. Okay. So the bed and board obligations, because it's a conferral body of right, again, this is not my teaching. This is what the church and the moralists and the saints have taught forever. It's just that it collapsed after Vatican II because people stopped talking about it. According to the moralists, because the wife is a helper, not a slave, but a helper to the husband, it's his obligation and his responsibility to tend or to oversee every single aspect of the household and everything. Now, I'm not suggesting that the husband tells his wife where to put the pots and pans, because if he does, I'm wondering to myself, what kind of guy does that, right? I mean, it just means there's some effeminacy. He's got control issues. But what it means is that what is the husband's job? His job is to raise the children, to work, to provide for that on a material level, and so as a result of that, the wife, so that he can go off and work, has to stay home and take care of the children. There's discovering this even psychologically. There's books coming out right and left. It's hard to keep up with them, in fact. But what they're finding out is that, which the saints have, and the moralists, St. Thomas and Aristotle even talk about this, the first 5 years of a child are absolutely crucial. And the reason they're crucial is why? Because it's during that time that these associations between good behavior and bad behavior arise. So when you punish bad behavior and you reward good behavior, the child, that foundation of associations in his mind begins to be trained. The child's mind begins to be trained throughout the course of those first 5 years. In fact, the Jesuits used to say, give me your child at the age of 12, because by then there's also been, they've been reinforcing that through virtue, because you can't develop virtue until later. They said, give me a child at the age of 12 and you can have him the rest of your life. This is why Catholics, once they've had a Catholic moral formation, their conscience is always Catholic even when they leave, and their conscience is always bothering them. But what they've discovered is that association of right and wrong has to occur between the ages of, from the time, about 10 months or so until about 5 to 6, depending on when the child comes of reason. They also know that it's the empathy and the emotional empathy of the mother that is the guiding force in that process of directing the good and the bad in the mind of the child. This is why the children, what they've discovered is that children who end up in daycare, they don't get the empathy of the mother. There's not the reinforcement of what's right and wrong. It's a battlefield, because basically they're getting brutalized because there's 30 of them and there's one woman trying to keep them all under control. And so the kid never develops that ability to associate the good and the bad based upon how the mother empathizes or doesn't empathize with the child. So what they're finding out is that this drastic rise in what they call disaffective disorder, which is the inability of people to emotionally connect, is in large part connected to daycare. A psychologist, this is one of the reasons too, the demons know that structure. They've known it forever because they know human nature. And so one of the first things they're always trying to do is get the parents separated, the child separated from the parents, right? This is one of the reasons why communism is so diabolic, because they think it's the state's place to raise their children. Sorry, it's not the state's place. The state only has a right to step in when there's grave violation of the spiritual or physical health of the child. Outside of that, they have no rights whatsoever. But communism thinks that the state has all the rights. Okay. So the other thing is, we just saw yesterday some kid goes in and mows down. I'd be curious to see if the statistic bears out. They know that 80% of these kids are on psychotropic drugs. They're mowing everybody down. But the other thing is that a psychologist who's a friend of mine did research. Again, this is not a scientific conclusion, but it is kind of telling. She said she was wondering why these guys are going in and mowing people down in schools, which, by the way, it's usually men rather than girls. I mean, you don't see some girl walking in and mowing people down, and I think there's a reason for that, because I think masculinity is under full-blown attack. And the reason it's under full-blown attack is because the demons absolutely hate the father figure, because they hate God the Father with a complete passion, because he was the one who determined the tasks and they rejected it. Okay. But that all being said, what she discovered is that the only thing these kids ultimately had in common, at least to the sampling that she did, was that they all had been at daycare. So this is one of the things that demons are trying to do, is get them separated. This is why the church has always said that the husband actually has a right to the wife to stay home and take care of the children. The wife has a right to stay home and to be provided for. And this is something, because there's a generation coming up right now. You hear these guys saying this. Well, if we can't make the ends meet, you're going to go out and get a job. Excuse me. My father worked 3 jobs so that my mother could stay at home. And if you're going to be a man like him, because I think my father is one of the most masculine men I've met, you're going to have to come up to speed here. Right? And it's just effeminacy, some guy welching on his responsibility. Okay. So he has a right for them to stay home. The children have a right. Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict, and Pope Francis have all said that the children have a right to be raised by their parents. A right. And it's a grave right because of the fact that it has a grave impact. And so it's important that we recognize this, because why? The demons are going to chisel away at that. They're going to try and get the focus on other things. Usually, they're going to try and get it to the point where they say, you know, really, your child needs a Harvard education, right? No, he doesn't. You have no obligation to get your kid through college. Your obligation is to get them to the age of 18 and the stage, at a state in which they have sufficient virtue and sufficient education in order to navigate the world. You're not obligated to send them through college. Is it a good thing to want to send them through college? Yeah, but you cannot commit grave sin by neglecting your children and putting them in daycare in order to do that later. Okay. Another thing that demons will do is try and tempt people to avarice and worldliness to obtain things. You know, the wife should go out home so she can get that extra car. We really want a bigger house. You need to go out and do that. Also, they'll constantly foster this expectation of having a standard of living that is unreasonable. They will incite people to have debt that is they're not capable of paying it off. Right? They're constantly getting people to do this, A, because they want the debt, because the person is not going to fulfill their obligations in justice to the bank or whoever, the credit card company, but they're also trying to do it in order to hold the couple hostage, right, to other people. So if they want a standard of living that's unreasonable. I mean, all of us know that when our parents first got married, they lived in an apartment and they had practically nothing. They were happy to have a couch and a bed. Now, kids get married, they want depending on where you live, a $300,000 to $400,000 house, 2 cars. They want it completely furnished. By the way, they need the boat, of course, and they need to have, ATVs and all this stuff the first year they're married. That is absolutely absurd. The other thing is, too, is it fails to see this. I see this with couples who don't go that route, who don't go the debt route, who just struggle along and and they'll have a large family, and so they have to live poorly. There's a certain joy you see in them through the struggle that they're trying to do. They're trying to achieve this by doing it right. There's a certain joy that you see in it. And part of this is because the demons are trying to tempt the spouses to distract from the children's upbringing in order to bring them something that's not necessary. You don't need that. Demons will guilt parents into thinking that their children do not have a high enough standard of living. Oh, my kids, they deserve better. In fact, what your kid really deserves is for you to help him develop virtue, and if that means he has a lower standard of living, that's a good thing. They did a study. They polled, I think it was like 1,000, maybe a little bit less, but they polled a bunch of billionaires, and they said, what's your biggest concern? Our children have no ambition. Of course they don't. You've constantly given them everything, and this is what demons try and do. They try and use a natural inclination. It's good for parents to want their children to have a good life, but that good life is first of all consummate with virtue and holiness, not with financial assets. But they'll get them focused on that. There's a temptation of a woman to have a career. This all started during World War II. And by the way, the feminist movement, I don't blame the women for that, it's the men. If men were men, when women started piping up and wanting to neglect their household duties, the men would have stood up and said, shut your yap and go home and take care of the children. But instead, what they did is they just let the women have their way. I've actually I did a homily one time where I made the observation that the very structure of the feminist movement today was actually completely outlined by the communists. And if you want to read it, I think it's even online, there is an interview of Vladimir Lenin by Clara Zenkin. And when you read that, it sounds exactly like all the tripe you hear from the feminist movement. Now, don't get me wrong, I think that guys have treated women poorly throughout history. I agree. But the solution isn't for women to go off on their own and to have this equality with their husbands. St. Thomas, and this is the thing that demons are always trying to do, is get us distracted with this life. St. Thomas says women are in 3 states. The first state is a state of subordination. So when Eve was created, she was created by the natural law to be under Adam as his helper. But he says the hallmark of that state is that Adam loved her, took care of her, was solicitous of her, etc. Then after the fall, she entered into a state of subjection. And he said the hallmark of that is Adam doesn't take care of her. He's not solicitous of her, etc. But she's still under him because of the natural law. And he says, whereas in heaven, women are neither in a state of subordination or subjection, because some women rule in heaven. Obviously, that's the case. We have Our Lady, right? And a variety of saints. So I tell women, look, in this life, don't try and control your husband. Don't try and be the head of the household. Don't try and wear the pants in the family. Subordinate yourself to your husband in a rightly ordered way according to virtue, and in that process you'll become holier to him, so then when you're in heaven you can boss him around for all eternity. Don't go for the short-term payout. All right. But the demons are constantly getting that focused. Look, Adam doesn't like the curse he's under. Eve doesn't like the curse they're under, and so there's that tension of they have to really actively fight that. There's also, during World War II, women actually went to work, and they liked the money. They liked the self-sufficiency that it gave them. It's a difficult thing for women to have to ask their husband for money or to be dependent upon him, but that's her state to God. But if the husband is rightly ordered, he will be free with that. Guys will say to me all the time, and this is something that the demons constantly foster, all she does is spend money. Excuse me. What is she supposed to do? Who's buying the groceries? Who's fitting the house? Who's buying the diapers? Excuse me, but that's her job, is to spend the money, but moderately, right? So she has to, guys when they go into a grocery store, or to any other store, unless there's certain kind of stores, like when I go to a used bookstore, I can blow a lot of time there. But usually, guys go into a store, let's get the thing and get out, right? Whereas women they'll pick the product, they'll look at it, they'll put it down, they'll look at the next one, right? The reason being is because it's right in Genesis. In Genesis, she looked at the fruit and saw that it was pleasing to the sight. She just likes looking at the thing, right? Okay. Now, God gave that to women, though, because why? If you're going to do shopping properly, you got to take the right time. How many times have guys here gone to the store, bought something, and realized later it wasn't even what they were supposed to buy? Right? Okay, guys aren't raising their hand because they're too ashamed to admit it. All right. Reminds me of the joke of Fulton Sheen. I don't know if you've heard this one, but one time when Fulton Sheen was first ordained, the pastor was up there giving the homily about how women are the head of the household. And finally, at a certain point, the pastor says, if there's any man here who can honestly say he's the head of his household, let him stand up. Well, nobody stands up for a little while. Finally, some guy all the way in the back stands up holding his hat. Right? So the pastor says, oh, so you're the head of your household, huh? The guy says, no, my wife told me to stand up. All right. Now, the one thing that women are going to fight, and demons are going to really use that, and this is why what's very sad, the feminist movement is sad. Because women are unhappy. Whenever we give in to the curse, whenever Adam becomes effeminate, or it becomes irresponsible. That is, when a man is not, he's not willing to physically or psychologically or emotionally sacrifice for his wife, and he's not willing to take responsibility, there's a chink in his armor, and he's not satisfied with himself. This is why the millennial men are miserable, because they've been emasculated. But the women, on the other hand, if she tries to control her husband or seeks that self-sufficiently independent, she's miserable. I have never met a woman who works, and this is why demons drive this. They want to make us miserable. I've never met a woman who works full-time when she doesn't need to, who's happy. She might be emotionally satisfied with her career, but she's not at peace, because it's contrary to what God designed her for. So Satan will tempt women towards that self-sufficiency. And that's why, because that's what he did with Eve. It's ambition. He said, you're not going to die. Instead, you're going to be like the gods. He was tempting her to take on and to become self-sufficient herself, independent of Adam. Okay. In Prumer, we read, the wife owes, that's part of the debt, to have attentive, actually the term in Latin is painstaking, care of the education of children. Children have a grave right because it has a grave impact on them. And in domestic matters as her condition demands. The wife sins if she neglects the domestic matters exceedingly, indulging in desires and pleasures. Equally, she sins if she exceedingly indulges in soft living and thus exasperates, actually the Latin term is irritates, her husband. Okay. So what does this mean? If she neglects her duties, she sins. And the degree of the sin is based upon the nature of the neglect. If it's grave neglect, then it's a serious problem. Putting the child in a daycare for 8 hours a day in order to carry on a job which is not absolutely necessary, there's not a grave cause for that. I mean, it's one thing if it's necessary. You're going to lose your house and home, etc. On the other hand, they should not enter into marriage. One of the things I tell people is this. The two of you are working now. After you get married, as long as she can take care of the domestic duties, she can work, providing her husband says okay, and she can work, but once the children come, she's got to stay at home. But in the meantime, once you get married, you stop living off both salaries. You live only on the husband's salary, period. Okay. Because the demons are constantly trying to drive people to set up a situation where they get overextended financially so that both have to work. Marriage is for the sake of children. This means that if one enters marriage without being ready to have children, you see this all the time. Oh, we want to get married, but we're not ready to have children. Well, then you're not ready to get married. The very nature of marriage is ordered towards children. And so this is something which people tend to think that, oh, well, we'll just use NFP for the first couple of years, and then once we kind of get comfortable around each other and we're settled a little bit more, and we get to a certain place financially, we'll have children. Well, then you're not ready to get married at all yet. And part of this is just an immaturity on people's parts. You're just not mature. One time, this one woman, it was kind of funny. She started courting this one guy, and so I started referring, she just liked this guy first. And so I kept referring to him as her boyfriend. She's not my boyfriend yet. Yeah. Then, about 2 months later, they started courting. Oh, how's your fiancé doing? She gets this half smile. He's not my fiancé yet. Yeah. Then once they got engaged, I said, and so her father asked me, well, how did you know this? I said, you could see it. The minute you could see that she saw in this guy something that really drove her emotionally as a woman, and what it was is, this was one of the most mature and responsible men I had ever met at the age of 18. Ever. He literally, at the age of 19, was ready to start his own business. At 23, he started his own business, and within the first year was already making a profit. At the end, he was, and they wanted to have children immediately, and I'm like, that's the way. This is what it used to be 50, 60 years ago, generally speaking. For the sake of children, one of the things that the demons have done phenomenally well at is convincing people that children are in fact evil and not good. They're not good, right? Why would you get married and have children, right? Or if you have one or two because you kind of want to fulfill that satisfaction, but don't have a lot of them, right? They're not good. This is why we have abortion. The contraception is basically a sign of children aren't good. And so you'll actually see this. It's kind of the height of irony, by the way. And one of the attacks that demons do on people who have a large family is you'll go into the grocery store, for example, because I've heard this example over and over again, and the people will see, how many kids do you have? Oh, we have 7. 7? Can't you control yourself? It's a good thing I'm not standing there. I would just say, are you and your wife on contraception? Yes. Well, you're on contraception, so you don't have to control yourself. That's the whole point, isn't it? It's the inversion, right? Demons constantly invert everything. But the point I'm getting at is that the demons will make children are a burden, a bit of a burden, but there's also a joy that people have in them. And that means that if parents are willing to sacrifice for their children, then that's where the whole selfishness thing comes in. The selfishness in relationship to men not willing to deny themselves and be the head of their household, but it's also the selfishness of women in relationship to the curse of Eve and how it's playing itself out in the feminist movement. That selfishness is driving people. The only time they ever have children is when they want the child for themselves, rather than it just being a sacrifice because they want to have a large family. Parents are called to sacrifice for their children and for each other. That means you don't get what you want in marriage. You don't. People have this idea that, I can't wait to get married because it's going to be so lovely living together. Yeah. The fact is, and by the way, marriage is a beautiful institution. It's a magnificent thing when it's lived properly. But a lot of times people don't live it properly. This means that if you enter into marriage without being ready to have children, and you're not willing to sacrifice from day one, then you are not entering into marriage with the right spirit, and the demons are going to use that against your marriage. They're watching you, they're seeing what your motivations are, and they're going to use them against them. This is one of the reasons why there's a certain kind of doctrine called providentialism, which is basically what? Just let God determine when you have children. Most of the time, in fact, in the entire time I've been a priest, 21 years, there's only twice I've told people, you need to go on NFP. One of them was because of the fact that the mother had this grave health condition and they were trying to get it under control. The other one was the woman was literally ready to put in a rubber room. That's why Pius XI mentions for grave psychological causes they can use NFP. She was literally, they had 6 kids in 6 years and she was like losing her mind. And because she, and basically I just said, look, you're going to have to slow down a little bit until she can kind of get on her feet. Okay. But providentialism is letting God determine it. The demons, because God said, go forth, be fruitful and multiply. Why do the demons attack that? One, because every child is in the image of God, which they hate. Second, every child that's born and is baptized eventually is going to take the place of one of the demons. Because when God created a hierarchy of nature, of angels, and their state of grace was directly proportionate to their nature. And when they fell, they left gaps in that, and so the theological speculation is, that God created man to fill that gap. And so the demons are going to try and make sure every child is killed or never gets baptized in order to make sure that he doesn't get that part that might have been his or what have you. And so this is one of the reasons why demons are constantly attacking the fruitfulness of the marriage. The fruitfulness of the marriage. It's their first attack. And how do they attack the fruitfulness? By dividing the couple psychologically. That's how they end up doing it. You see this all the time, is that people's conjugal life very often takes a beating because psychologically they're completely divided. And that's a very common thing, and the demons have won in a certain sense, because there's not as many children, there's not as much joy in the marriage, etc. Okay. We're going to stop there. In the next conference, we're going to resume how demons attack the notion that marriage is a sacrifice, how they attack that, and what they'll actually do to subvert that. So, if you'll kneel, I'll give you a blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, super vos et manet semper. Amen.
Christus vincit, Christus regnat, Christus in